Welcome to the fifth lecture in the Mid-Tudor series. Today we will examine how successful Mary was as the first Queen of England between 1553 and 1558. This lecture will be split into three parts. Firstly, we will examine the problem of female rule and the implications for Mary's rule. Then we will examine the implications of the Spanish match and the concerns about England becoming a satellite state of Spain. We will then study Mary's style of government and her relationship with her Privy Council. Let's first examine the concept of female rule in a 16th century concept. Firstly, it is worth noting that England had only ever had one queen up until this point in history, the Empress Matilda. However, since she had never received an official coronation, she was not recognized officially as a Queen of England. Furthermore, her succession to the throne had caused 11 years of civil war known as the Anarchy, as she fought for power against her cousin Stephen. Therefore, England did not have a true precedent for female rule, which made both Parliament and the nobility nervous. Mary was related to two queens, her grandmother Isabella of Castile, and her aunt Joanna of Castile, which set a recent precedent in Europe. However, these two Spanish princesses had a rocky time, especially Joanna, who was confined to house arrest by her father and dubbed Joanna the Mad by history. This would not have instilled confidence in the political nation that Mary would have a successful reign. Added to this, most of society believed that it was unnatural for a woman to rule. This is partly for biblical reasons, going back to the original sin of Eve in the Garden of Eden, when she tempted Adam to eat the apple. This belief was reinforced in the Great Chain of Being. This system placed women below their husbands. This was reflected in law, since any heiress that inherited land or property would pass this over to her husband in marriage. The only women that could live a financially independent life were widows who had been awarded a pension in their late husband's will. This would have huge implications for Mary if she chose to marry. Arguably, the most important concern related to a woman's traditional role as childbearer and mother. The principal job of the Queen of England was to produce the next heir to the throne. This was especially important to Mary, who had no close male relatives to pass the throne to. Instead, the throne would go to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. Mary was 37 years old when she succeeded to the throne. By contemporary standards, this was very close to the menopause, and for a woman to undergo her first pregnancy at this age was high risk. All women, both rich and poor, feared childbearing since mortality rates were high. Therefore, Mary's capacity to conceive and then safely deliver a healthy heir to the throne was under severe doubt from the start of her reign. Mary has a notorious reputation as the first English queen known as Bloody Mary due to her actions against the Protestants. Geoffrey Elton wrote a scathing summary of her personality when he said that, quote, Mary was arrogant, assertive, bigoted, stubborn, suspicious and rather stupid, devoid of political skill, unable to compromise. It is true that Mary had a very stubborn personality. However, Elton goes too far in saying that she was devoid of political skill. Mary had weathered many storms in her early adulthood, including separation from her mother and banishment from the royal court. As a result, she was not going to be easily manipulated by the men of her council. Like her father, she did have a stubborn streak, and she was determined to achieve two key things: the marriage alliance with Spain that would rekindle the Anglo-Habsburg alliance, and the full restoration of the Catholic Church. Let's now examine the Spanish match, which is the term used to describe the marriage of Mary to Prince Philip of Spain. Philip was the son of Charles V and soon to inherit the Habsburg Empire, which covered lands in the Holy Roman Empire alongside Spain. By this point in the 16th century, Spain rivaled France in power and wealth, and the conflict between the two nations continued. A marriage alliance with Spain would hasten the restoration of the Catholic faith, since Spain were a staunchly Catholic nature. This had implications for the Protestant population, however, since it meant that Philip would bring with him the Spanish Inquisition, the infamous method of torture and execution of heretics that refused to repent. Furthermore, there was a question mark about how much time Philip would actually spend in England, since he had duties in Spain, and the less time he spent in England, the less likely it would be for the royal couple to conceive an heir to the throne. There were also implications for if Mary was successful in conceiving an heir to the throne. Philip already had a son by his first marriage born in 1545, so any heir to the English throne would not have a claim to the Spanish throne. However, if Mary was to die during the child's infancy, it would be easy for Philip to set up a regency council of Spanish nobles. Worse still, as her widower, he could even stake a claim to the throne himself if she died without heirs before him, which was likely since he was nearly a decade younger than her. Both these scenarios would make it easy for England to become a satellite state of Spain. There was an alternative to Philip of Spain, an English nobleman called Edward Courtenay, who had Plantagenet blood. Like Philip, he was younger than her. Mary showed him high levels of affection when he appeared at her court, and Mary's chief minister, Stephen Gardiner, encouraged the match. Courtenay himself saw himself as a suitable candidate. According to the Spanish ambassador, there was, quote, much talk here to the effect that he will be married to the Queen, as he is of the blood royal. He even organized his royal household so that it appeared like a smaller version of the royal court, and several courtiers were known to kneel in homage to him. However, there were also disadvantages. A domestic candidate could open the door to factionalism and rivalry at court. There was also the concerns about what would happen to the crown if Mary died before Courtenay and leave behind either no heir or an infant heir. At that point, Courtenay would have been well placed to seize power. In the end, Parliament petitioned Mary to marry an Englishman, but Mary ignored their wishes and made her intentions clear that she intended to marry Philip of Spain. However, the match could not be made immediately. It would take months to prepare for Philip's arrival, and during that time Parliament drafted up a law that would prevent Philip from gaining too much power. The wedding did not take place until July 1554, a full year after the death of her brother Edward VI. This meant that Mary lost another crucial year, when she could have conceived and bore an heir to the throne, something that could have happened if she had chosen a domestic suitor. Whilst the Spanish match was being arranged, there was civil unrest, most notably the Wyatt Rebellion of February 1554. This was led by Protestant aristocrats, and their main grievance was the Spanish match. They also expressed displeasure at the idea of the English court being occupied by foreigners, in other words, Philip's Spanish retinue. Parliament placed safeguards in place to prevent Philip from gaining too much power, and thus prevent England from becoming a satellite state of Spain. For example, even though Philip was given the title of king, he was only ever a consort, in other words, the partner of the Queen. Secondly, he was forbidden from bringing foreigners to his court, or installing his own advisors on the Privy Council, so to reduce the level of Spanish influence. Finally, and most importantly, Philip's rights and privileges would come to an end should he outlive Mary, meaning he had no claim to the English throne. Let's now examine Mary's style of government and her relationship with the Privy Council. As England's first queen, it was very much an expectation that she would take a conciliar approach to government, unlike the ministerial style that her father adopted. However, this is not to say that Mary did not set out the key aims and create policy. The two most important decisions were made by her: firstly, the religious direction, with the restoration of the Catholic faith, and secondly, her decision to marry Philip of Spain rather than a domestic candidate. These two decisions also dictated the direction of foreign policy, as the Anglo-Habsburg alliance was now rekindled. However, she also relied upon key members of her Privy Council to act in her best interests and implement these policies. Firstly, Mary could not simply inherit Edward's Regency Council, since they had all been complicit in some way with the succession crisis of 1553. They all swore loyalty to Lady Jane Grey, before turning their back on Northumberland and switching their allegiance to Mary. Therefore, Mary only kept two of Edward's councillors, William Paget, who had been sidelined from politics since the downfall of Somerset, and William Cecil, who was able to convince Mary that he had only played witness to the signing of the devise. Cecil outwardly conformed to the Catholic faith throughout Mary's reign, but maintained correspondence with Elizabeth, which helped him to become her chief minister and steadfast advisor. Mary then appointed key ministers to her Privy Council that she knew would support the restoration of the Catholic faith. Many of these had formed part of the conservative faction during the last decade of Henry's reign. One notable comeback was Stephen Gardiner, who was released from prison and then promoted to the position of Bishop of Winchester. He was then given the honor of crowning Mary at her coronation, since the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was now imprisoned for heresy. The second remarkable comeback was Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who had spent Edward's reign in the Tower after narrowly missing the executioner's axe for treason at the end of Henry's reign. As a military man, he had a final hurrah when he led troops against the Wyatt Rebellion in February 1554, but he did not play an active part in politics. He passed away in August 1554. Another significant member of Mary's council was Reginald Pole. He had spent most of his life in exile, since he was the great-nephew of Richard III and Edward VI, making him the last surviving Yorkist claimant. Henry VIII had brutally executed his mother Margaret Pole in 1541, aged 61, for no other reason than her Plantagenet blood. Pole had returned to England as a young man during the late 1520s, but choosing his Catholic faith over loyalty to the crown, he had then left for exile again in the early 1530s. In 1536, the Pope had made him a cardinal of the Catholic Church. This made him technically the highest-ranking churchman in the English Church. He returned to England under Mary and used his status as cardinal to influence the bishops into passing key legislation to restore the Catholic faith. He worked closely with Stephen Gardiner to achieve Mary's religious agenda. Mary I married Philip of Spain in July 1554, and when Philip arrived, he brought with him a retinue of Spanish courtiers and advisors. Parliament had put restrictions in place to prevent these advisors having a seat on the Privy Council, but this didn't prevent them from having an influence at court, even after Philip had left for Spain. The most influential was the imperial or Spanish ambassador, called Simon Renard, who maintained a close relationship with Mary throughout her reign. This Spanish influence was not welcomed by the English courtiers, especially in the final year of Mary's reign, when England becomes dragged into another war with France due to the Anglo-Habsburg alliance. Let's now consider how well Mary used a conciliar style of government. Certainly, she filled her Privy Council with like-minded advisers who shared her goal to restore the Catholic faith. However, historians have criticized Mary's Privy Council for being too large, since at its peak it had 50 appointed councillors. This meant that key personalities, like Stephen Gardiner and Reginald Pole, were able to dominate policymaking in a similar way to how Somerset, Cromwell and Wolsey had in previous decades. There was also cultural tensions between the Spanish advisers who came over with Philip from July 1554 and the English Privy Councillors, but there is little evidence to say this hindered progress in the restoration of the Catholic faith. Let's now examine the question of how suitable was Mary I to be England's first queen. Firstly, it is important to remember that Mary had to overcome significant obstacles since society believed that it was unnatural for women to rule. This made her marriage to Philip of Spain even more significant, since traditionally a woman should give away her property and rights to her husband. However, an Act of Parliament prevented Philip from ever being more than her consort. Finally, Mary relied on experienced members of the conservative faction and devoted Cardinal Reginald Pole. This meant she had a group of like-minded advisers who were able to work together for the smooth restoration of the Catholic Church. However, by the end of her reign, she was also relying on Spanish advisers, and this led to England being sucked into another Habsburg-Valois conflict against France. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next lecture to learn about Mary's restoration of the Catholic Church.